Okay. Torture from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. For other uses, see torture. Torture from Latin tortus, to twist, to torment, is the act of deliberately inflicting severe physical or psychological suffering on someone by another as a punishment or in order to fulfill some desire of the torturer or force some action from the victim.
Thank you.
Torture.
Yourself.
Elliot, shut up.
Do I have to wait on Elliot? Is that what's going on here?
No.
No,
Ash,
no. I thought we
continue.
were still talking. Go ahead.
Okay. Torture, by definition, is a knowing and intentional act. Deeds which unknowingly or neglectingly inflict suffering or pain without a specific intent to do so are not typically considered torture. Torture has been carried out or sanctioned by individuals, groups, and states throughout history from ancient times to modern day. And forms of torture can vary greatly in duration from only a few minutes to several days or longer. Reasons for torture can include punishment, revenge, extortion, persuasion, political re-education, deterrence, coercion of the victim or a third party, interrogation to extract information or a confession, irrespective of whether it is false, or simply the sadistic gratification of those carrying out or observing the torture. Alternatively, some forms of torture are designed to inflict psychological pain, or leave as little physical injury or evidence as possible, while achieving the same psychological devastation. The torture may or may not kill the injure the victim, but torture may result in deliberate death, and serves as a form of capital punishment. Depending on the aim, even a form of torture that is intentionally fatal may be prolonged to allow the victim to suffer as long as possible, such as half-hanging. In other cases, the torturer may be indifferent to the condition of the victim. Although torture is sanctioned by some states, it's prohibited under international law and domestic laws of most countries. Although widely illegal and reviled, there is an ongoing debate as to what exactly is and is not legally defined as torture. It is a serious violation of human rights and is declared to be unacceptable, but not illegal, by Article 5 of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signatories of the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the Additional Protocols 1 and 2 of 8th of June 1977, officially agree not to torture captured persons in armed conflicts, whether intentional or internal. Torture is also prohibited for the signatories of the United Nations Convention Against Torture, which has 163 state parties. National and international legal prohibitions on torture derive from a consensus that torture and similar ill treatments are immoral, as well as impractical, and information obtained by torture is far less reliable than obtained by other techniques. Despite these findings and in international conventions, organizations that monitor abuse of human rights, e.g. Amnesty International, the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims, Freedom from Torture, etc., report widespread use of condoned by states in many regions of the world. Amnesty International estimates that at least 81 world governments currently practice torture, some of them openly. Definitions. International level. UN Convention Against Torture. The United Nations Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatments of Punishment, which is currently in force since 26th of June 1987, provides a broad definition of torture. Article 1.1 of the UN Convention Against Torture reads, "For the purpose of the convention, the term torture means any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining from him or a third person information or a confession, punishing him for an act he or a third party has committed or is suspected of having committed, or intimidating or coercing him or a third person for any reason based on discrimination of any kind when such pain or suffering is inflicted by or at the instigation of or with the consent of a acquaintances of a public official or other party acting in an official capacity. It does not include pain or suffering arising only from, inherent in, or incidental to lawful sanctions. This definition was restricted to apply only to nations in government-sponsored torture, and clearly limits the torture that perpetrated directly or indirectly by those acting in an official capacity, such as government personnel, law enforcement personnel, medical personnel, military personnel, or politicians. It appears to exclude 1. Torture perpetuated by gangs, hate groups, rebels, or terrorists who ignore national or international mandates. 2. Random violence during war. And 3. Punishment allowed by national laws, even if the punishment uses techniques similar to those used by torturers such as mutilation, whipping, or corporal punishment, when practiced as lawful punishments. Some professionals in the torture rehabilitation field believe this definition is too restrictive, and that the definition of policy-motivated torture could be broadened to include all acts of organized violence. Definition: Declaration of Tokyo. An even border definition was used in 1975 Declaration of Tokyo, regarding the participation of medical professionals in acts of torture. For the purpose of this declaration, torture is defined as the deliberate, systematic, or wanton infliction of physical or mental suffering by one or more persons acting alone or on the orders of any authority to force another person to yield information, to make a confession, or for any other reason. This definition includes torture as part of domestic violence or ritualistic abuse, as well as in criminal activities. Rome Statute of the International Crime Court. The Rome Statute is the treaty that set up the International Crime Court, or the ICC for short. The treaty was adopted at a diplomatic conference in Rome on 17th of July 1998 and went into effect on 1st of July 2002. The Rome Statute provides the simplest definition of torture regarding the prosecution of war criminals by the International Criminal Court. Paragraph 1 under Article 7E of the Rome Statute provides that torture means the intentional infliction of severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, upon a person in the custody or under the control of the accused, except the torture shall not include pain or suffering arising only from, inherent in, or incidental to lawful sanctions. How many more definitions are there? That's not that many. We get into history. Inter-American Convention to Prevent and Punish Torture. The Inter-American Convention to Prevent and Punish Torture, which is in force since 28th of February 1987, defines torture more expansively than the United Nations Convention Against Torture Article 2 of the Inter-American Convention reads, "For the purpose of this convention, torture shall be understood to be in any act of intentionally performed whereby physical or mental pain or suffering is inflicted on a person for purpose of criminal investigation, as a means of intimidation, as personal punishment, as a preservation measure, as a penalty, or for any other purpose. Torture shall also be understood to be the use of methods upon a person intended to obliterate the personality of the victim or to diminish his physical or mental capacities. Even if they do not cause physical pain or mental anguish, the concepts of torture shall not include physical or mental pain or suffering that is inherent in or solely the consequential or lawful measures, provided that they do not include the performance of these acts or use the methods referred to in this article." Amnesty International. Since 1973, Amnesty International has adopted the simplest, broadest definition of torture. It reads, "Torture is the systematic and deliberate infliction of acute pain by one person or another or a third person, in order to accomplish the purpose of the former against the will of the latter." European Court of Human Rights. The UN Convention Against Torture and Rome Statute and the definitions of torture include terms such as severe pain or suffering. The International European Court of Human Rights, or the ECHR for short, has ruled on the difference between what is inhumane and degrading treatment and what is pain and suffering, severe enough to be torture, And in Ireland versus the United Kingdom, 1979 to 1980, the ECHR ruled the 5 techniques developed by the United Kingdom: wall standing, hooding, subjecting to noise, deprivation of sleep, and deprivation of food and drink, as used against 14 detainees in Northern Ireland by the United Kingdom, were inhumane and degrading, and breached the European Convention on Human Rights, but did not amount to torture. In 2014, after information was uncovered that showed the decision to use the 5 techniques in Northern Ireland in 1971 to 1972 had been taken by British ministers, the Irish government asked the ECHR to review its judgment. In 2018, by 6 votes to 1, the court declined. In Asgoy v. Turkey, 1997, the court found Turkey guilty of torture in 1996 in the case of a detainee who was suspended by his arms while his hands were tied behind his back. The court's ruling that the 5 techniques did not amount to torture was later cited by the United States and Israel to justify their own interrogation methods, which included the 5 techniques. The court had ruled that from the form of torture is strictly prohibited in all circumstances. Article 3 of the Convention enshrines that one of the most fundamental values of democratic societies, even in the most difficult of circumstances, such as the fight against terrorism or crime, the Convention prohibits in absolute terms torture or inhumane or degrading treatment of punishment. Article 3 makes no provision for exceptions and no derogation from its permissible under Article 15 weird S symbol 2, even in the event of a public emergency threatening the life of the nation. Municipal level, United States, U.S. Code 2340. Title 18 of United States Code contains the definition of torture in 18 U.S.C. 2340, which is only applicable to persons committing or attempting to commit torture outside of the United States. It reads, as used in this chapter, torture means an act committed by a person acting under the color of law, specifically intended to inflict severe physical or mental pain on or suffering, other than pain or suffering cited to lawful sanctions, upon another person within his custody or physical control. Severe mental pain or suffering means the prolonged mental harm caused or resulting from a. the international infliction of or threatened infliction of severe physical pain or suffering, b. the administration of applications or threatened administration or application of mind-altering substances or other procedures calculated to disrupt profoundly the sense of their personality, c. the threat of imminent death, or d. the threat that another person will immediately be subject to death, severe physical pain or suffering, or the administration of application of mind-altering substances or other procedures calculated to disrupt profoundly the senses and personalities, and 3. United States means the several states of the United States, the District of Columbia, and the Commonwealth territories and possessions of the United States. In order for the United States to assume control over this jurisdiction, the alleged offender must be a U.S. national or alleged offender, must be present in the United States, irrespective of the nationality of the victim or alleged offender. Any person who conspires to commit an offense shall be subject to the same penalties, other than the penalty of death, as the penalties prescribed for an actual act of or attempting to commit an act, the commission of which is the object of the conspiracy. Torture Victim Prosecution Act of 1991. The Torture Victim Prosecution Act of 1991 provides remedies to individuals who are victims of torture by persons acting in an official capacity of any foreign nation. The definition is similar to the U.S. Code 2340, which reads, torture. For the purpose of this act, the term torture means any act directed against an individual in the offender's custody or physical control, by which severe pain or suffering, other than pain or suffering arising only from or inherited in or incidental to lawful sanctions, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on that individual for such purposes, such as obtaining from the individual or third person information or a confession, punishing that individual for an act that the individual or third person has committed or suspected of having committed, intimidating or coercing the individual or a third person or any reason based on discrimination of any kind, and 2, mental pain or suffering, referring to the prolonged mental harm caused by resulting from the international infliction of threatened infliction of severe physical pain or suffering, the administration of application or threatened administration of application of mind-altering substances or other procedures calculated to disrupt profoundly the senses of their personality, the threat of imminent death, or the threat of another individual who will immediately be subjected to severe physical pain or suffering, or the administration or application of a mind-altering substance or other procedure calculated to disrupt profoundly the senses of personality.
Thanos
Chapter 2, we're on to Chapter 3, History.
Oh.
In the study of the history of torture, some authorities rigidly divide the history of torture per se from the history of capital punishment. While noting that most forms of capital punishment are extremely painful, torture grew into an ornate discipline, where calibrated violence served 2 functions: to investigate and produce confessions and to attack the body as a form of punishment. Entire populaces of towns would show up to the witness an execution by torture in the public square. Those who had been spared torture were commonly locked barefoot into stocks, where children took delight in rubbing feces into their hair and mouths. That's funny.
Feces.
Talk about poopy. Should I continue?